There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I have some personal news. It has a happy ending, so don't get too concerned as you're listening to it, but my dad was rushed to the hospital last Sunday night by ambulance because he was having trouble catching his breath. This is a problem that had been getting very gradually worse and worse since Christmas time, and Sunday night it just kind of hit the point where it was like, okay, it's time. And he has pneumonia. So the great thing was, even before the ambulance arrived at the hospital, he was put on oxygen and immediately started feeling better. And so we all went down to the hospital, of course, and my goodness, there my father was in the temporary hospital room, which ended up becoming his hospital room for the entire week, in emergency, feeling so much better with this oxygen that he was ready to get up and do a little jig. They put him on antibiotics and they diagnosed it as pneumonia the next day, and he's just been getting better and better, and he's coming home today. This was quite a worry for everyone this week. I've spent quite a bit of time with Dad and Mum in the hospital, and so has all the family. It's great to have everybody around, and my niece Amy is a nurse who works at that hospital, so that was a really helpful coincidence. So yeah, he's definitely on the mend, and by all appearances he's going to make a full recovery, so great. So that's my personal news. And holy smokes, have I got a mystery guest for you. Let's go meet her, shall we? What an incredible treat to welcome Nancy Pearl as this week's mystery guest. Nancy Pearl of Booklust fame and all kinds of other bookish fame. Nancy, what an honor.
Oh, shucks, Sean. Happy to be here with you.
Oh my goodness. Well, I am over the moon that you said yes to my rather audacious invitation. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So if you don't know, and if you don't know, where have you been? Nancy Pearl is the author of several books about book recommending and reader's guides that have just been incredibly popular over the years. And the first one, I believe, is Booklust. Is that right?
It is. Yes, it was published in 2003 by a Seattle company, Sasquatch Books. And amazingly, it is still selling. I just think that's so wonderful. And it was followed by 3 more. The second one was called More Booklust. Now, personally, that was not my choice. I really wanted the title to be Booklust 2, The Morning After. But yeah, we didn't go in that direction. And then the third one was a book called Book Crush, and it was books for kids and teens. So that was really fun to do because, Sean, I began my library career as a children's librarian. That was what I had always planned to be. And then the fourth one is possibly, Booklust will always have a place in my heart because it was 1,000 or so of my favorite books of all time. But the fourth one is called Booklust to Go, and it's books about explorers, books about various countries, books for the armchair traveler, the real traveler. Although you could argue that the armchair traveler is just as real as the real traveler, but I'm a kind of, except for going to England, which I love, I'm kind of an armchair traveler in all other ways. But working on that book, all those books I read to write that book was, oh my gosh, it was just such a delight.
And then you have a book about writers talking about their favorite writers. Is that right?
Yes. So that one is called The Writer's Library, and it's interviews with various writers, various authors, not about the books they've written, but about their life as readers. And I did that with a friend of mine here in Seattle. So the fun thing about that was that we were fortunate enough, it was pre-pandemic, although the book came out at the height of the pandemic, but it was pre-pandemic, and we went to these authors' homes or met with them in their neighborhoods. We met with Louise Erdrich at her bookstore, so places like that. And so that was really fun. We met with Jennifer Egan at her home, Amor Tolles at his home. So we spent a lot of time in New York and Brooklyn, meeting various authors at various places. But then it was really all over the country. There are no Canadian authors in that book. We really wanted to interview Margaret Atwood, but her schedule is very busy, and she's probably not doing things like that from kind of unknown authors. But I have to say, just put it out there, that Canadian fiction is really high on my list of books that I love. And it's always fun for me to read, like, who are the finalists in the Giller Prize, or, just because it's a lovely way of introducing myself to writers that I might not meet, in air quotes, otherwise. So what's her name? Laura Lanssen's book, The Girls, for example, was one of my, do you know that book? It's amazing.
I don't. So you need to recommend Canadian books to me, obviously.
Right. Well, that one anyway. Jane Urquhart, another contemporary Canadian novelist, the Underpainter, I think is my favorite of her books. Just an amazing, those two novels, I mean, they just blew me away. So, and there is something to me very interesting about Canadian fiction, that you know a Canadian writer as opposed to an American writer, partly because of the sense of place, I think, that you get in Canadian fiction. Do you agree?
I do. And a sense of home, and a sense of the place we call home being a challenging place to live because of the climate.
Mm-hmm. Right, for
So
sure.
I have a suggestion for the Canadian edition of Book Lust, Nancy.
Okay.
Canadian Book Lust, baby, it's cold outside.
Right. Well, you and I would have to do it together, because I would need a Canadian book person, and you would be, just great.
And we're not even getting close to the bottom of the list of all the wonderful things you're doing, bookishly and otherwise. So you have a TV show.
I do. Pretty amazingly, since 2004, I have interviewed authors who have come, or in the beginning, authors who have come to Seattle. During the pandemic, we switched to, well, we took a year or so off because we couldn't figure out what to do. But now we're still taping it. So I'm on Zoom and the author is on Zoom. But it actually works really, really wonderfully well. And I've been so fortunate to be able to interview just some wonderful, wonderful writers. I was so fortunate to interview Terry Pratchett, for example. This was before the dementia, this was early-ish in his career. And I'm a huge fan of of Terry Pratchett. And I have to say, in that interview, I was teaching at the University of Washington's, what was then library school. And, I assigned the interview to my students because we were studying fantasy fiction. And my students just, all came back and said, "Oh, Nancy, you just fawned all over him," because which was true. I did. I think those books are brilliant. And he was a brilliant, brilliant writer who is so sadly categorized as fiction, as a fantasy. So people who don't like fantasy don't read them. But, there's so much in all those books. They're just, I think, a perfect pick-me-up. They're wonderful commentaries on society, and they're just great. So,
Well, you're working your magic on me, because I've never seriously considered reading one, because I'm not into fantasy. So where should I start, Nancy?
well, okay, I would start with, there's one called Going Postal, which is terrific, and a sequel to that called Making Money. So there's just like within his oeuvre, those two books fit together. And then there's a whole internal series that's set in the Ankh-Morpork police force. And those are, along with going postal and making money, are my favorites. So
Wonderful. Um, you have had a huge impact on readers. I think introducing a lot of readers in the West to the idea of bailing. And was that in Book Lust, where you kind of gave a
um,
formula, or you didn't intend it to be a formula, but it kind of became people's personal
yeah,
formulas? Can you talk about that?
right. Sure. It was actually, I was doing radio for the local Seattle public radio station, and I was on every week. And a woman called in and said, well, I'm really not enjoying this book that I'm reading. When can I stop? And never at a loss for words. I have to say that about myself.
Yeah.
I just made up on the spur of the moment that you should give a book 50 pages. And at the bottom of page 50, you should ask yourself, am I really enjoying this book? And if you are, of course, go on and read it. If all you care at the bottom of page 50 is who the murderer is or who marries whom, go to the last page. Or, oftentimes I will start a book, that I get a little bit fed up with the author's ticks or something just doesn't, I'm not in the right mood for it maybe. Then I'll just go to the last, personally, I will just go to the last chapter and read that and then feel satisfied that I've done that. But, always, Sean, always I say, which sometimes gets lost, that at least 80% of why we like a book or not is due to our mood. So often we'll pick up a book and we'll be not in the right mood for it. So if you give up a book, that doesn't mean you can never pick it up again. My favorite example is that when I wrote Book Lust, I said in the introduction, gee, I said, here's my email. I'd love to hear from you about what books I haven't, I'd love to compile a reading list. So tell me what I've left out that you loved, thinking I would get 2 or 3 emails and that would be good. Well, many people wrote in, and the most common thing that people said was, why don't you have any books by George R. Martin on it? How come you don't have, I think then there were 2 of the books in the series. And I had never read them, even though I am a big fan of fantasy. So ever obedient, I went out and bought the first book in the series and started reading it and didn't like it. I read about 50 pages and I just couldn't, I didn't see what the fuss was about. So I put it on the bookshelf. And then I started working on more Book Lust. And I thought, okay, this is a good chance. I'll, pick up that book and start reading it, Game of Thrones, and I'll I'll read it now, and then I'll include it. Well, I started it a second time and just didn't like it at all. I mean, I read the same darn 50 pages, and I didn't connect with it. So more Book Lust went out without any George R. Martin in it either. A little embarrassing to think about that now. But then, so months and months later, after the die was cast and I hadn't included Game of Thrones, I was flying to Spokane, which is on the other side of the state of Washington. So it's like maybe like an hour and a half flight. And I was going to do an all-day workshop for one of the libraries there. And I, needed a book to read on the plane. So I just grabbed Game of Thrones and started reading it on the plane as we were going to Spokane. And I read those same doggone 50 pages, but this time, oh my God, I loved it. I
That's great.
just loved it. It just grabbed me. And it was one of those things where every moment that I had to spend doing the workshop, I really regretted that I wasn't reading Game of Thrones. So when I got back to Seattle, having read it all the way back, I stopped. I took a bus into downtown Seattle from the airport, and I stopped at Elliott Bay Book Company so I could buy the next books in the series because, I just couldn't wait. And that was all mood, really. It had nothing to do, his words didn't change. It was me who changed. Now, the fun about the bailing on a book, that 50-page rule, which is what people always quote, is when you're over 50, when you're 51 and up, what you do is subtract your age from 100, and that number, which gets smaller every year, is the number of pages you should read before you can, I say legitimately, but before you can give up on a book without guilt. Now, what that means is that when you turn 100, the great reward is that you can judge a book by its cover. So that is the Nancy Pearl rule of bailing on books. So
How wonderful. And you've also clarified that it isn't a rule and anybody should be able to bail wherever they want. I
absolutely.
am infamous on BookTube. I used to call myself the queen of bailing, but I promoted myself and now I'm the empress of bailing. There's an article that you were interviewed for in the Washington Post just in
Yes,
early January. Gonna have
right.
a link to that in the show notes. Um,
Good.
and yeah, so the last thing that we're going to talk about in terms on your roster of literary achievements is you have a novel published. Tell us about that.
So I never thought that I would write a novel. I was very happy reading other people's novels, but these two characters appeared in my head, and a man named George, a young man named George, and a young woman named Lizzie. Originally, I knew where they met, which was at a bowling alley in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where I went to college. But beyond that, I knew nothing about them. But they wouldn't leave my mind. I just found myself thinking about George and Lizzie pretty much constantly. I'm a big walker. I walk every morning. On my daily walk, I go through like fraternity or sorority row on the University of Washington campus, and I would think, oh, did Lizzie belong to a sorority? That kind of thing. To put myself to sleep every night, I would tell myself stories about them. And I was really happy doing that. I loved that. I loved the more I knew about them, the more I wanted to know about them. And so one day, as happens to, I think, all of us who are readers, I couldn't find anything to read. Would go through my bookshelf. I would pick up books to see if I wanted to reread them or look at my to be read shelf, whatever. And I couldn't find anything that just satisfied what I wanted at that moment. There was nothing at the library. I couldn't find anything at the bookstore. I did the whole thing. And then I thought, but wait a minute. I have these stories in my head and I love these characters. And so I sat down at the typewriter, not at the typewriter, at the computer, and I wrote what became the first chapter of George and Lizzie, which is the name of the book. And that chapter is entitled How They Met, and it begins, they met at I think it's called Bowlerama, way out on Washtenaw bowling alley, and just sort of takes off from there. I think the interesting thing about the book is if you love character-driven novels, it's a book for you. And you can pretty much always tell a character-driven novel because the title is going to be the name of characters or it's going to be descriptive of characters. So the book had to be called George and Lizzie. And they meet when George is a dental student and Lizzie is at the University of Michigan as a freshman. I have to say, for people who might want to go on and read the book, it's not particularly autobiographical. The thing that you learn very early on about Lizzie is that she made some pretty unfortunate choices in high school. And I did not make those particular choices. I made my own bad choices, but what Lizzie's choice was not mine. Anyway, I loved the book. I loved writing it. And one of the interesting things is that the story of George and Lizzie is told in chronological order pretty much, but around that story, you get to meet them and their friends and relatives at different times in their life. Because one of the things I really appreciate in a book is a bit of quirk. And of course, if I'm writing a book for myself, which is what I thought George and Lizzie was going to be, I would have some quirkiness in it. And that is the quirkiness.
Well, as someone who is very much of a character reader, I look forward to reading it, and then I'd like to have you back and have a long chat about it. How's that sound?
Oh gosh, I'd love that.
So, we only have a few minutes left, but you're reading a bunch of good stuff. Tell us about it.
Yes, so I just discovered a new writer named Donal, Donal Ryan. I think the
Oh,
Irish writers are certainly having a moment. The book that I'm reading is The Queen of Dirt Island, which is about three generations of women in a family. And I'm listening to it. I'm a big fan of audio books, and it's read by a wonderful Irish reader. Again, it's about characters. It's a character-driven novel. Each section is 500 words exactly. And so there's my quirk. That there's the quirkiness that I really love. But there is a wonderful novel that was just published called Beautyland, one word, by Marie-Helene Bertino. And she wrote one of my very favorite books a few years ago called 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas. And this one is about a girl. We meet her when she's born, actually, and she just doesn't fit in to the world around her. And the reason she doesn't fit in, and this is not a spoiler at all, you learn this right away. Adina, her name is an alien, and she has been sent to Earth to explain Earth to explain what Earth people and tendencies and everything else about Earth to the rest of the people on her planet.
I heard her interviewed about the 2 a.m. book, and I always wanted to read it. I heard her interviewed on some book podcast. I don't remember what it was, but I took note of it and haven't gotten to it. But this one sounds interesting too. And Donal Ryan, yes, very. I have a soft spot for Irish literature on BookTube. There's an Irish readathon every March, and I participate in a big way. So yes, I love Irish literature.
Well, Sean, have you read Leonard and Hungry Paul by
Not
Ronan
only
Hesse?
not only have I read it, but Ronan Hessian has been on my channel about 6 or 7 times.
Oh, wow. Yes, I
Yes.
got to interview him when the book was chosen for the
Oh,
one book, one Dublin. I think that's what it's called.
yes.
And what I loved about talking to him was that he and I both are not so interested in plot in a novel. What we're really interested in is character and the quality of the writing.
He is equally fascinating as a reader as he is as a writer. And so I have him on at least once a year to talk about what he's been reading because he reads a lot of Chinese literature in
Right?
translation and
Yeah.
lots of
Yeah.
women writers in translation from all over the world. He's just
Yeah.
incredible. So
Yeah.
he sent me his arc for the third novel, Ghost Mountain, which comes out in May. So,
Yes, me too. I have one
oh,
too.
good.
Yep.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
wonderful.
I think he's like great. Just a
He,
great writer and a great reader.
so, a bit of a smart ass question to close, Nancy. Do you get more puns about your surname or about about the title book lust?
Book lust, there were some issues at the beginning because of the lust in the title, but I think people have grown to love it. And I have to say it's a they're all very chatty books. So when you're reading them, it's like, and this is how I wanted it and how the editor wanted it. It's like I'm talking to you. And I have to just say, I got to read the audiobook for George and Lizzie. And what I hear from people who know me, who have listened to it, that it's kind of like me listening to it, kind of like me sitting next to them, telling them the story of these two people.
Oh,
So,
I'm so glad it's on audio. I'll probably do it that much sooner. I'll probably
oh,
read it that
good.
much sooner if it's on audio. And so if you're not getting as many puns about Pearl, then I'll say thank you for sharing all these pearls of wisdom with us, Nancy. Absolutely delightful to have you here, and I hope you'll come back someday.
I will come back whenever you want me to. I would love it.
How how lucky am I? Happy reading in the meantime. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh my God, Nancy Pearl on my wee little channel. That was just amazing. And here is my week in review. And of 8 books that had been collecting dust, some of which I think I had moved from Canada to Japan, and then from Japan back to Canada, that I have to either read them, bail them, or get rid of them.
A lot of his later books, and I'm only talking about novels with him. I completed all his novels, not like all his short stories or essay collections or anything like that. The fascinating to me with him is that he lost a bit of his energy, vibe, if you want to call it that, to me at least, in his later works, where in the earlier books, they had like this more potent, raw kind of feel to them that you can like feel the passion on the page. You could feel the rage off the page. It just has that quality. And I found in the later ones, it almost, I don't want to say that it was redundant. It feels almost in a way blasphemous to say that about James Baldwin. But this is sort of how I felt. I just felt like, you know, there are some authors where their earlier stuff is just their stronger work. And then afterwards, it becomes not monotonous, but it's a little bit like samey, more of the same. I've seen this before and done better before. But when I got to his final book, which is just above my head.
Two Serious Ladies. She's kind of like one of my favorite writers, Elizabeth Jane Howard. The only reason her husband is famous is because he was married to her. Paul Bowles, I read his most famous novel. It was pretty awful, but the short story I read really got me intrigued. With Jane, the talented one in that marriage. All right, so I have 2 books finished to tell you about. One of them I'm only going to speak of... one of them I have a discussion video for a pseudo buddy read type discussion coming down the pipe, so I won't say a whole lot about that one, but I'll say a significant amount. And the other one was an audiobook I finished this week. The novel that I finished in time, like 30 minutes before I had my pseudo buddy read Zoom chat about it, was this 1997 British gay novel, Now and Then, by William Corlett. It's actually 1995, but who's counting? This is one of the best gay novels I've read. I loved it even more than I did the first time, which I read it, I think, in 1997. I think that's where the confusion comes in. I think it's because I relate more to the gay man as his older self. The story is split into the then chapters, which are about his time at boarding school when he was about, 15 or something. And then now when he's in his 40s. My 40s are long gone, but I related more to it than I did in my late 20s, the adult section. And the protagonist had a traumatic romantic sexual relationship in boarding school that left him emotionally devastated and paralyzed until the time of when this novel opens. So he is a celibate, closeted gay man, not out to anybody and not really having anything to be out about in his 40s. And he starts remembering this beautiful, painful, traumatic love affair he'd had as a teenager. I just found it absolutely heartrending. I think the book's still in print. Let's find out. It is still very much in print, I think, still in this original edition, so that's wonderful. If we need to hang on to the idea of a canon for gay literature, this one should have pride of place. I often say that sex in gay fiction or any other kind of fiction is usually best left just very indirect and hinted at, but in this case there was explicit sex scenes that were so incredibly vital to the story, and I don't think would bother anybody but a homophobic reader, that just were so incredibly tender. And I don't mean to imply that there was a whole bunch of them, but there were a few, and they were essential to this young boy's story. Oh, I think I'll leave it at that. I have a chat with my pseudo-buddy reader, was the wonderful Erica from Louisiana, who's been on my channel several times over the years, and she and I discussed this in a Zoom chat video that will be coming fairly soon to my channel. It's one of the best gay novels I've read. The other one I did completely on audio because the audio narration was so wonderful. This is a book that was touched on by Lara in the Newfoundland fiction video last week, and I also did a bite-sized book chat with her about this novel before, which is what sold me on it. It's called This Is How We Love by Lisa Moore. And oh my goodness, I loved it. 5-star read. I mean, there was one thing that maybe didn't quite work for me, but not enough to make me budge off a 5-star read. I say that a lot when I tell you I have a 5-star read. You know what? It reminds me of another book where the title kind of put me off, but the story didn't put me off in the slightest, that had the word love in the title, and that was the Trinidadian novel, Love After Love by Ingrid Persaud. Loved that novel, squirmed at the title. The title actually in that case came from a poem by a Caribbean, probably Trinidadian poet, but not knowing that, it sounded really overly sentimental. And this one too, I wasn't sure about because of the title, This Is How We Love. But in fact, in a completely, I think, completely unsentimental way, it is a very intricately plotted web of stories that center around the 21-year-old son of the narrator. She's mostly the narrator, although there are sections that she doesn't narrate her at. The 21-year-old young man, Xavier's mother, and her name is Jules. And she and her husband are in Mexico on vacation when their son in Newfoundland, I never did catch whether it was in St. John's or where in Newfoundland, but it's certainly a city in Newfoundland, is violently attacked and with life-threatening injuries, just as a terrible winter storm descends on Newfoundland. And I think it goes across most of North America, because she had trouble even getting on a plane. There was only one seat, and she came back. Her husband couldn't get back for several days. And then once she got there, I mean, it was all she could do to even get into the hospital, because it was just, the whole city was snowed in, like unbelievably so. I think the army had to come in and sort of sort things out before the storm ended. And then we're getting the backstory, this web of relationship between the various characters. And there are step family relationships and there are foster family relationships that are part of this web of connection. And Lisa Moore does a fantastic job of making a story really complicated to show you how simple love and relationships are. And I'll leave it at that. She makes you realize that the foster parents are as important not only to the story but to the characters in the sense of This Is How We Love, that just really worked for me. Beautiful, beautiful writing. Stay tuned for a great Sunday sentence coming this Sunday from this novel. Tentatively, my one criticism would be, and this may be a factor of the fact that I was listening to it without following along with the text very much, and also that it was in the middle of an emotionally draining week for me. But my one criticism would be that I wasn't sure it needed to be quite so complicated, and that wasn't quite sure that so many of the family members back in the past needed to be in the story. But I would say that very tentatively, because I think it really all worked, but it was a lot to follow when I was doing it on audio. And I wasn't sure there needed to be quite so many family stories in the novel. But oh my goodness, it sure has made me curious to read more by Lisa Moore. She is an English prof as well as being a novelist. One of her books, which one? February. Oh, Lara has talked quite a bit about February. That's the one about the sinking of the oil rig, the Ocean Ranger in 1982. That one was nominated for the Booker. I think it made it to the shortlist, actually, but I'm not sure about that. She's an English prof as well I believe at Memorial University in St. John's. I am really curious to explore her writing in more detail, because this one really knocked my socks off. It was just incredibly powerful. Such strong, nuanced characterization and lovely, lovely writing. All right, so that's what I finished. I'm going to start 3 books this week because I have 2 that are coming up for where I'll be a guest on a couple podcasts that I got to get started if I'm going to be ready for those discussions. The first one, I'm delighted to have been asked to be a guest on an upcoming episode on one of my very most favorite bookish podcasts, the Book Club Review podcast. Kate has been on my Zooming In series as a guest, and she is one of the co-hosts there, and she has invited me to come on. She's doing one on Japanese lit, and we're reading and discussing this one, which was in my book haul last week, Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, translated from the Japanese by Polly Barton. So I'll be starting that. And I'm going back on Anna Bailey Karas's podcast, Books on the Go, right around the same time to discuss this novel, Home Reading Service by Fabio Morábito, translated from the Spanish by Curtis Bauer. I had to look up which language because this author is just incredibly fascinating. Fabio Morábito was born in Egypt to an Italian family. And then when he was 15, they moved to Mexico. So which language did he write in? But yeah, it's written in Spanish, translated. It is about... I had a bite-sized chat with Stu, I think. Yes, I think it was Stu of Winston's Dad blog that put this on my radar. It is the story of a man that was sentenced. I think he was at fault in a car accident or something, and he was sentenced to a year of community service reading to people shut in and unable to read for whatever reason, the elderly and disabled, and it's about that experience. It sounds just incredible. I'm also going to be starting one of the books from my If I Don't Read These Books in 2024, I Have to Unhaul Them video that just went up. And that is Cormorant Lake by Faith Merino, who is an American writer who lives in Sacramento. I believe the premise is that a young woman leaves with her very young and very neglected little girl, so I don't know what the situation is, and returns to her hometown in the Northwest, called Cormorant Lake, and plot ensues. This was, I think, on my most anticipated list for, 2021, and it's been sitting on my shelf ever since. Time to get to it. So, lots of exciting things coming soon on my channel. I've mentioned a couple of them, and there's a whole bunch more than that. Videos coming, and collaborations, and my goodness, life is beautiful. Especially now that my dad is almost fully recovered from pneumonia. That's what I got this week. Thanks for watching.